Who, oh who, will get to inhabit this building as the next President of the United States? Will it be him, or will it be her? Maybe him, Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson? Probably not. Maybe her, Jill Stein, Green Party candidate? Probably not as well. The election of 2016, as always, will not come down specifically to the person who gets the most popular votes. Instead, the United States votes by a system called the Electoral College. The Electoral College was originally established way back at the time of the framing of the Constitution that gave votes not to the people in terms of voting for president, but to people known as electors. Instead of voting directly for the presidential candidate, you vote for electors who then turn around and vote for the actual candidate. Some people think that this is grossly unfair, that especially in today's day and age, in 2012, we ought to directly vote for the presidential candidates. But that's not going to happen, at least for 2016. So we are faced with the reality as it exists now. The way the Electoral College works is that if you win a state, even by one vote, and you're a presidential candidate, you get that state's entire complement of electoral votes. Each state gets a number of electoral votes that is equal to its number of senators, which is always 2, plus its House of Representatives, which is 1 or more. That's why the least possible number of Electoral College votes you can get is 3. Small states like Alaska, Wyoming, Montana, even the District of Columbia, which doesn't actually have any senators or representatives but gets 3 anyway, by special constitutional provision, have 3 electoral votes. Bigger states, in terms of population, get a lot more. California is the biggest with 55, then Texas with 34, New York with 31, Florida's 4th with 27, and you can see there are many states that are kind of in between the big states and the large and the small states. Because of this distinction, and the fact that you can win a state by a small margin and get its entire complement of electoral votes, it is possible for one candidate to win the popular votes and another candidate to win the Electoral College vote. This has happened 4 times in United States history, of course most recently in 2000, when then Vice President Al Gore won the popular vote against former Governor George W. Bush at the time, but lost the Electoral College because of the fact that Bush won Florida by under 600 votes. Since then, the map, although of course the White House has changed parties in 2008, the basic way in which the map looks and the basic pattern has not changed all that much. Even though of course we had 2000, the Bush got elected, and then when 2004 when Bush got reelected, the map looked substantially the same. Only 3 states changed hands. New Hampshire went from Republican red to Democratic blue, and Iowa and New Mexico changed in the other direction. Every other state, in other words 47 states, stayed the same. The 2008 presidential election, of course, saw the Democrats and President Barack Obama win the election, and of course the map looks a lot more blue than the previous 2004 one, but you can see that the contours and patterns are pretty much the same. The Democrats and President Obama were able to flip Florida, Colorado, New Mexico. New Mexico was Democratic in 2000, but Nevada, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, North Carolina, Virginia, but probably about 42 states pretty much stayed the same as they had in 2004. The 2012 election was very similar to the 2008 election. Once again, President Barack Obama winning re-election. The only states that flipped between 2008 and 2012, I believe, were Indiana and North Carolina. Everything else pretty much stayed the same. So when you're dealing with the 2016 election and what will happen, we can't necessarily look to the overall popular vote because the overall popular vote might not necessarily determine the winner. We also don't want to be too heavily influenced by what we see in states that are almost certain to go one side or the other. For For example, whether Trump loses California by 10 points or by 30 points doesn't matter because he's going to lose. He's 99.999% chance that he's going to lose the state anyway. And the converse is true. Whether Hillary Clinton loses Texas by 5 points or 15 points again doesn't matter overall. What we are looking for when we start with any kind of electoral college analysis we're going to look for states that have a chance to be the tipping point. Tipping point state is a state that makes the difference, that puts one party or another over the top, so to speak. You need 270 electoral college votes since there are 538 altogether, and the state that gives you your 270th vote, your 270th electoral vote, is the state that is the quote-unquote tipping point. This is a map, incidentally, of since I think 1856, how often each state has been the tipping point state. In other words, the state that made the difference between winning and losing. With the pink states having done it once, the red states having done it twice, and the dark red states having done it more than twice. You can see New York actually I believe 6 times was the turning point, not tipping point, not any time in the last 100 years, but at one point, believe it or not, New York was a swing state, but of course not anymore. California also used to be a swing state. Many of these states used to be swing states like Illinois, but not anymore. Ohio, on the other hand, of course, is still very much a swing state, which means it can go either way, and it's of course very important in in who wins the election. Florida, for example, was the tipping point in 2000. Ohio was the tipping point in 2004, and in 2008 and 2012, the tipping point, in other words, the state that gave President Obama his 270th electoral vote, was actually Colorado in both elections. So what we're going to focus on, and what the candidates focus on, are the states that have a chance to be a tipping point state. This is from 538.com, kind of based on to the right, a stronger lead for Donald Trump, and to the left, a stronger lead for Hillary Clinton. And according to this analysis, this is what is necessary for 270. So according to this analysis, as of right this moment, based on who's winning in each state, Wisconsin would actually be the tipping point. But there's also a chance that pretty much anything in this area, any of these states, would be tipping point states. Extremely unlikely that a state like Illinois or Massachusetts or California would be a tipping point state. Extremely unlikely that a state like Tennessee or Indiana or Kentucky would be a tipping point state. But these states in the middle here, the quote-unquote swing states, are the ones that are going to get the analysis. For example, North Carolina or Iowa or Arizona could be swing states. They could be won by either candidate, but if these are competitive, that means Hillary Clinton has won the election anyway, so they really don't matter. Hillary Clinton might win Georgia, but it just doesn't matter that much, because if she wins Georgia, she's won the election by a lot, so it makes no difference. Conversely, theoretically, if Donald Trump was competitive in New Jersey or Oregon, which, theoretically could be possible for a Republican to compete in, then the election's over anyway, so the candidates aren't going to worry so much about New Jersey and Illinois and Oregon, because if those are competitive, the Republican has won anyway, and if they're not going to worry so much about states like Indiana and Tennessee and Kentucky, because then the election's over anyway if those are competitive. According to 538.com, and this changes from day to day, Florida actually has the best chance of being the tipping point state, not because it's right in the middle, it's actually slightly more Republican leaning than the country as a whole, but because it's such a big state, because it has 27 electoral votes. Obviously, to be a high chance at a tipping point state, you have to, number one, be very close to the national average, and number two, it helps to be a big state. So Pennsylvania, which is a little bit more Democratic leaning than the normal state, still has a pretty good tipping point chance. Whereas New Hampshire was not even on this list, and New Hampshire is very close to the middle on this chart. That's New Hampshire right there. It's actually, as of a few days ago, New Hampshire was actually right here on this line, a tipping point state. It doesn't even make the list because it only has 4 electoral votes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a little bit of my own little primer in terms of which states are going to be competitive, which states are going to be critical, and which states can actually swing the election. Okay, first of all, we've got Maine up here. Maine is typically a Democratic state, although Maine is one of only 2 states in the country, the other being Nebraska, that does not give all of its electoral college votes to the winner. The upstate section of Maine actually could be could be very competitive. Um, According to some polls, upstate Maine, which is the second district, actually has Trump in the lead. But for the time being, let's assume Maine is going to be blue. New Hampshire is one of those swing states, so we're going to leave that for the time being. The rest of New England, let's put New Hampshire as we'll leave that blank. The rest of New England is all pretty solidly blue for Hillary Clinton. New York the same. New Jersey can be competitive. Certainly Republicans can do well there on statewide elections, but is very unlikely to be competitive in this election. Delaware used to be a swing state, not anymore. Maryland, very solidly Democratic on the presidential level. Virginia used to be solidly Republican, not anymore, so we're going to leave that blank. Same with North Carolina. South Carolina will start giving to one of the states where we start with the Republicans with a strong advantage. Georgia also we have to give to the Republicans, not because it's a guarantee for Donald Trump, but because if it's competitive, that means the race is not competitive. If Hillary Clinton ties or almost ties in Georgia, it means she wins the presidency by a lot, because Georgia's probably 7 or 8 points further Republican leaning than the country, which means that if Georgia's close, it means the country as a whole has gone very far over towards the Democratic side. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, all of those solid Republican. Same thing with Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. None of these are really swing states. Texas also, there's certainly Democrats hope to be able to galvanize the Democratic base in Texas, and especially Hispanic voters, certain minority voters, but it's still very unlikely to be competitive, and it's again one of those states that if Texas is competitive, then the race is pretty much over. Same thing is true with most of the middle of the country, the Great Plains, Kansas, Nebraska. North Dakota was actually a little competitive in 2008, so was Montana, but we're going to assume that in a competitive race, it would definitely be Republican red. Same thing is true with Idaho and Wyoming. Utah, there's an interesting dynamic with the very heavy Mormon vote, but it usually goes Republican by like 40, 45 points. I don't know if it's going to be so competitive, so we're going to make it red. Now we will go to Alaska, which is typically Republican in a presidential election. Hawaii is Democratic. Hawaii, President Obama won Hawaii by something like 40, 50 points. Okay, and the West Coast typically goes Democratic, so we're going to give the West Coast to the Democratic candidates, to Hillary Clinton. And that's, again, typically what we're going to see. Now we've got the upper Midwest. Minnesota is the only state to have gone Democratic each of the last, 10 cycles or so. Minnesota was the only state to vote for Walter Mondale back in 1984. Minnesota is not that likely to be competitive. It's a little closer than you would think, generally speaking. Illinois, also very solid Democrats. And now we start getting into the swing states. Let's take them one by one in terms of combinations. And I'm going to look at these. What happens if you have a close election? If you have a close election, then Michigan is going to have to be Democratic. Now, Michigan used to actually be a tipping point state. I think Michigan was actually the tipping point state twice in the 1980s. Michigan used to be considered the most important state in a general election. Now it leans much more heavily towards the Democratic side. So I'm going to put Michigan in blue. I'm also going to put Indiana in red, as the polls, again, President Obama did win Indiana in 2008, but it's unlikely to be competitive this year, and if it is, it doesn't mean good things for Donald Trump, let's just put it that way. Missouri used to be considered one of the best bellwether states in the country. Between 1904 and 2004, I think Missouri only voted with the losing candidate once, and that was 1956 for Adlai Stevenson, but the last two elections have been won by the Republican candidates in Missouri while lost in the nation as a whole. Missouri is typically 4 or 5 points now more favorable to the Republicans than the rest of the country, and so therefore, in a very competitive election, it definitely means Missouri would go red. Similar things could all be said for Arizona, so we're going to put Arizona in red as well. What we have here is 209 for Clinton, 191 for Trump, and each one's got to figure out a way to get to that point. Pennsylvania, definitely a swing state, but tends to lean Democratic. George W. Bush lost Pennsylvania twice despite winning national elections. In a super duper competitive race, Pennsylvania probably would lean more Democratic. In other words, if the country tied, Pennsylvania would probably win. It would probably go to the Democratic side. Pennsylvania actually was almost a tipping point state in 2012. For a couple of days, they thought it was going to be a tipping point state. But in a super competitive race, you would expect Pennsylvania to be won by Hillary Clinton. Wisconsin is fairly similar. Wisconsin, as we saw before, was actually, according to 538.com, the state that's right smack dab in the middle. But still, you'd probably have to give it to Hillary Clinton in a super competitive race. Virginia is an interesting one because Virginia is a state that used to be solidly Republican. George W. Bush won Virginia twice without really breaking a sweat. I don't think even Bill Clinton, I believe, lost Virginia at least once, maybe even twice. Still, the polls are very, very strong in terms of in Virginia for Democrats. Right now, you definitely would have to give the Democrats an edge in Virginia. And the same thing in New Mexico. New Mexico, again, used to be a fairly good Republican state, not so much anymore. And then you've got how many states left? Now we've got 6 states left. And as you see, the Democrats are getting close. Hillary Clinton is getting very close over here. 257 electoral votes, only 13 more electoral votes are needed. So let's take these one at a time. First of all, we've got Florida. Now, Florida is a couple of points more favorable to the Republicans than the country as a whole. Remember, in 2000, the country as a whole voted for Gore. Florida was essentially tied. Bush won by a few hundred votes. In 2004, Bush won the country by about 2.5 points and Florida by about 4.5 points. Even in 2012, President Obama won Florida, but only by a very, very small margin, winning Florida by less than 1% and winning the country by about 3.5%. And a similar thing was true in 2008. So in an extremely tight race, you'd have to assume that Florida would go red and vote for the Republican candidate. Let's put it this way. If Donald Trump loses Florida, he's lost the election. There's virtually no chance of him winning the election without winning Florida. I would say the same thing for North Carolina. 15 Electoral College votes, slightly more Republican than the national average. In a super competitive race, Trump would have to have North Carolina. Now we get to Colorado. Colorado, the tipping point state twice. And so if you win Colorado, you're in pretty good shape. Still, this year, Colorado does seem to be polling a little bit more towards the Democratic side than the national average. So in a virtual tie, we'd have to give the edge to the Democratic candidates. And that leaves 4 states left: Nevada, Iowa, Ohio, and New Hampshire. Notice that Clinton only needs one more state at this point. If we give her the states that are strong, that seem to be strong Democratic, and the state that would almost certainly go to the Democratic candidate in a tie or in a virtual tie, we've only got 4 states left, and Clinton's got to win all of them. Trump has to win all of them to be elected president. He's got to win Ohio. Ohio is usually right around the national average, maybe a point or two more Republican than the national average. So he'd have to win Ohio, which would give him 253. He'd have to win New Hampshire, which is actually a couple of points to the Democratic side. Remember, if Hillary takes New Hampshire, then she's at 270 based on this map. So Trump would have to win New Hampshire, and Nevada, which is also a couple of points leaning toward the Democratic side, and Iowa. This would actually get to, well, D.C., of course. I'm sorry, D.C. is clearly a Democratic state anyway. This map, which is not impossible, would actually lead to a 269-269 tie. So this map, which actually a few weeks ago, during the conventions when Trump had a little bit of a bounce, was actually the map that on 538.com for a day or two was considered the most likely possibility. It didn't last because the bounce faded a little bit, but this is not an impossible situation. But the real states to look at and the ones that are really going to determine the election, I would say Ohio, New Hampshire, even though it's a small state, Iowa, which is basically tied, Nevada, which has been extremely close, and this is pretty much what you're going to look at. this actually has Hillary Clinton already at 269, and she only needs one more of these states to be put over the top. So hopefully this is helpful in terms of what to look for, in terms of where candidates go, where they spend their money, and we'll see what happens. It should be an interesting couple of months leading up to Election Day.